Well, good evening. Thank you for joining us once again in our continued study in the book of Philippians, what we called Finding Joy in Challenging Times. But what really, as we've discovered throughout the last several weeks, is it's finding joy in challenging times and unpredictable times, weird times, bizarre times, good times, tough times, times of grief and times of joy. How do we stay connected and find this joy no matter what time we are finding ourselves in? And so we're continuing in that for a few more weeks, and I'm excited with what we have to think about and read tonight. I do need to call out Pastor Rob a little bit. Last week he got a little excited and covered all of my verses as well. So I don't know that I have much to talk about, but we'll have fun anyways and dive in and see what this letter that Paul writes to the church in Philippi, what it may speak to us today, what it was saying to them then, but maybe what we can take from it today, sitting here in 2020. And as I got into this text, we're in chapter 3, if you're following along, starting at verse 7, and I'll read that in just a minute. But as I was getting into this idea of what we'll call for tonight transformative experiences came to mind. And what I mean when I say transformative experiences is those moments, those experiences that we have that shift the way we think about something. Like before this experience, we may see something a certain way or view something a certain way, think about something a certain way, and then we have this experience, this moment takes place, and all of a sudden it's transformative and we see things differently, we think about this thing differently, we interact with this thing differently. And I think we all have these experiences in different ways. As I was preparing for this evening, I came across this story. It's a story of a 6-year-old boy who grew up in the 1930s named Martin. He was a black boy, and in this story, we find that one of his best friends as a 6-year-old boy was this white boy whose family owned the store across the street from where Martin grew up. And this boy and him would play together. They were close friends. But when they started school in September of 1935 in segregated Georgia, this boy went to an all-white school while Martin went to an all-black school. And as this happened, this boy's parents decided that he was no longer allowed to play with Martin. His parents decided that they didn't fit together. And his parents told Martin it was because we are white and you are colored, and so he can't play with you anymore. And as Martin was talking to his parents about this and recalling this, his parents kind of unraveled the effects of slavery and how this race and segregation was playing out in the United States. And after that conversation, this 6-year-old boy told his parents this. He resolved that from this moment on, he was going to hate every white person. And his parents, in their wisdom and maturity, came alongside of him and said that because of God's work in their lives, because of who God is and what God calls them to do, that they are called to love everyone. You know, in the same breath, his dad talked about how no matter how long he lives, he'll never accept this reality of segregation and inequality. But they drove home this point to him about God's call to love everyone. And I think about this boy who grew up to be Martin Luther King Jr. And I think of this moment for him as he is marching and he's fighting against injustice and fighting for equality. I wonder if this moment ever came back to him or was in his mind of his dad calling him to love even the people that he felt this desire to hate. But in the same breath, also imploring him to not settle for this reality, but fight for a better, more equitable world to live in. Now, I think for Martin Luther, as he thinks back to that fall of 1935, that experience he had with his dad, I wonder if he would consider that a transformative experience. A moment that shaped the way he saw things. And from before that moment to after that moment, things were just different. He saw things, thought about things, interacted with things differently. And I think for many of us, maybe our experiences aren't as, or maybe not feel as profound as this story of Martin Luther King Jr. But I think we all have those moments. I think we all have things where we thought, we saw, we interacted with something one way until after that experience. And then after it, we saw and thought and interacted with something in a completely different way. Maybe it was a near-death experience that you had, or a diagnosis. Maybe there was a big move or a job promotion. Maybe you came into money, or maybe you lost money. Maybe it was something as simple as a movie you saw, or something that you witnessed or saw as you were driving home from work one day. But we have these transformative experiences. And for Paul, who wrote this book, Paul had one of those experiences in a pretty famous and dramatic way on the road to Damascus, where he encountered Christ, and he went from Saul, who persecuted and killed Christians, to Paul, who was one of the most instrumental leaders of the early church, who wrote most of what we call the New Testament. Paul had this experience, this moment that shifted and transformed everything for him. He saw and thought and interacted a certain way, and then after this moment, he saw, thought, spoke, and interacted with the world in a completely different way. And again, I don't want you to hear that you have to have this big moment like Paul or like Martin Luther King had, or any number of stories you may hear, because it doesn't matter how big or small these moments are, but as people, we're shaped by these transformative moments. And that was certainly true for Paul. And really, we're only looking at 5 verses tonight. We're looking at Philippians 3, verses 7 through 11. But for Paul, these 5 verses kind of are a summation of that transformation experience that he encountered. What we're going to read today for Paul was how his life looked different after he encountered Christ. And so let me begin by reading this. Again, it's Philippians 3, starting at verse 7. We're going to read through verse 11, and then we'll get into a few things that we're going to look at. Starting at verse 7. But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so, somehow, attaining to the resurrection from the dead. Again, we only have 5 verses here, but there's a lot that's happening in these 5 verses, a lot of things that Paul is reflecting on to this church in Philippi. And we're going to start kind of at the beginning. I've got 3 main things that I want to focus in on for the next several minutes. But the first one, it gets off right at the beginning in verse 7, when he says, "But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ." Whatever were gains, I now consider loss. The former things that he used to hold on to, the former things he used to hold in high regard, are now, to Paul, considered a loss for the sake of Christ. The things that he used to value and used to pride himself in are now a loss. And he's coming off at the beginning of this section, really the focus of last week's Bible study, was this section where he talked to the church about not holding their heritage or their lineage as their source of confidence, what he calls their source of confidence in the flesh. And we look back and he kind of lays out this idea that, look, you may have this temptation to say, look at me and who I am, look at my lineage, look at my heritage, look at my family. I should boast, I should put my confidence, I should put my trust in that history. But really what Paul says is, if we're going to do that, like, I would be the winner of that. If that's how we wanted to stake our confidence and our trust, I mean, me, Paul, I'm top dog. And so what Paul is saying is don't play that game where you put your confidence and your trust in all of those things that maybe other people put their confidence in. And remember that Paul is writing this letter to the church in Philippi, a church whose citizenship afforded them many privileges. I mean, they weren't the Gentiles, they weren't the scum or the outcasts, the ones that were thought of, but they were of Jewish descent, and they were the insiders. And it's important to note here what Paul doesn't say, because a lot of times when we read these letters, we can learn just as much from what Paul leaves out as from what he says. But he doesn't say here that their Judaism or his life as a Jew is worthless or it's silliness. But Paul warns them to hold off on having that and those aspects of their personhood be what they consider trust or confidence, what they put their hope in. See, Paul is saying, whatever were gains to me, I now consider a loss for the sake of Christ. That they were losing investments because they were part of a way of life that put their trust and confidence in flesh rather in Christ. But he doesn't just say this and moves on. He actually takes it a little bit further. And he says that he considers them garbage. In comparison to knowing Christ, he considers it garbage. Some translations say rubbish. The reality is, whatever translation you find here, whatever word is translated for, it's probably going to be a pretty soft, weak translation. Because the Greek word here, who we'll throw up on the screen, is this word that's skabula, which really means waste or decaying food. It even refers to human excrement. And so whatever you want to translate it to, it's probably not strong enough language of what Paul is trying to say here. And it's graphic and it's dramatic, but one of the things that Paul is trying to demonstrate here is this idea of the old versus new. And this is big for Paul. You know, Paul's not known for his subtlety. He won't go down in history as being a very subtle person. He seems to say what he thinks, and he sometimes does that in dramatic fashion by calling or comparing this old to the new as garbage and filth and feces. But this is a big point of emphasis for Paul in his letters, is this comparison of the old way of life to the new way. This transformed life that Paul experienced. He wants there to be distinction. He wants to make this I hesitate to use the word separation as if you are away from everyone else. But for Paul, it was really important to not underplay the change, I guess is the word, the transformation that happens in the life after coming to Christ. That there should be something distinct that marks the old way from the new way. If my students are watching in youth group, I probably overuse this analogy of the idea of looking at life through a different set of glasses. Like, these are my glasses, these are the prescription that's been made for me, and that works best for me. And this transformation, this old to new, is almost like taking off glasses and then grabbing another pair. If I were to grab Lauren's and put Lauren's glasses on, it's this seeing life, this transformation, like putting on a new set of glasses, like seeing the world through this new lens. There's transformation. Maybe your eyes are opened in a different way. And for Paul, this was a really distinct part of his story. To put on this new set of glasses, to have this kind of transformation, to experience this newness, that everything that you experience, that everything you interact with is different. The old to new. It's this transformation. And I think it's challenging for me, and it's maybe challenging for you as well. This question or thought is, does my life demonstrate this transformation? This thing that was so important to Paul, does my life demonstrate that? Does the newness offered through Christ permeate and demonstrate something different from my old life? I think it's something that I need to spend some time thinking about. What does that look like? What does that new creation within me through Christ look like? But Paul says, whatever I once considered a gain, compared to knowing Christ, I now consider a loss, rubbish, filth. But I think that brings up a good question. What was that he once considered a gain? And then that question, what did Paul used to consider a gain? I think it's going to lead us into this next point. And if we're going to jump ahead to verse 9, but actually I'm going to back up a little bit from verse 9, start at the beginning of that sentence, where he says, I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him. And here's what I want to key in on. Not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ. The righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. See, for Paul, this old things that he used to consider gains were this way of, and this source of pride and self-righteousness. Compared to knowing Christ, those former things that he staked himself on, the following the rules or being the most religious, being the smartest, the strongest, the most powerful, this thinking too highly of oneself, those points of pride, those are like rubbish and garbage, like decaying food and human feces in comparison to knowing Christ and being known by Christ. And remember, Paul is writing this letter not to a church that's in crisis or not to a church that's just barely hanging on. Paul writes this to a good and healthy church. And so I almost wonder, as he writes this, is this more of a warning? Is he warning this church to not look at the maybe success, whatever you want to call that this church is having, or look at the fruit that this church is having, and get complacent or begin to kind of pat yourselves on the shoulder and say, well, look what we've done, look what we've accomplished. It's like Paul is wanting to remind them, be careful. You're a good church, you're a healthy church. Look at, you're seeing people come to know Jesus as the way. But be careful, because don't begin to think that that is your own doing, or that you have somehow earned your own righteousness because of what you've done. You know, I think if we flip back just a few pages to a book called Galatians, we see these fruits of the Spirit. Those fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And I think when we think of the opposite of the fruits of the Spirit, we often think that the opposite of those things I just named are these obvious, vile ways of life. But I think what Paul is concerned about for this church may not be those obvious, vile ways of living, but maybe some more subtle ways of sacrificing the following of Christ. Things like greed and jealousy, gossip, lack of humility, and this self-righteous attitude. As a church that is healthy and good and growing, how do those things begin to creep in and keep us from being in tune with the ways of Christ? And if I'm being honest, I think I look at our church and I think that overall, I think we're a healthy church, we're a good church. We are hearing stories of people who are coming to know Christ and people who are growing deeper in their faith. And so I think in some ways, these subtle things that can creep into our lives are things that we need to be aware of, things that we need to be watchful of. You know, we are not excluded from the world we're living in, and that's not a bad thing. We're living in this pandemic, and this pandemic is also happening on an election year, and I know the temptation that we all feel to speak or to post or to interact or to comment on people's posts, and it's not just social media; it's also in person. But maybe a caution, just in the middle of all of this, is how do those fruits of the Spirit, how do those characteristics of someone who is living in tune with God's Spirit permeate into everything that we do, the way that we talk and interact? Sometimes I see a post and I wonder, where's our love and our joy and our peace and our patience in that? You know, where's our kindness, our goodness, our faithfulness, our gentleness, and our self-control in that post? And I know this is a little bit of a tangent, and I'll come back to verse 9 here in just a second. But I just want us to think about the ways that we represent this faith community, the ways that we represent this way of Jesus. And I so desperately for myself, but for all of us, long to embody this way of life, to be a people who embody these fruits of the Spirit. But getting back into verse 9, this idea of self-earned righteousness versus righteousness from Christ. Paul calls it righteousness from the law. But that self-righteousness can oftentimes look pretty religious. It can look pretty Christian. But I think for Paul, but what's also true for us, is this reminder that if those things that look a certain way lack Christ, then we're missing the point. Because this righteousness doesn't come from our own doing. This righteousness comes from Christ. And so Paul wants this good and healthy church to remember that their righteousness, that their ability to live out these fruits of the Spirit that I just mentioned, only comes from this deep unison and intimacy with Christ. It's not from their achievement. It's not from their ability to follow the rules or get the right answer, but only as they submit their lives to following this Jesus way of life, staying connected to Christ. And that kind of brings us to the last of the things I want to think about in these 5 verses. This idea of knowing Christ. See, 3 times in these 5 verses, Paul uses this word of knowing. He refers to it as of knowledge or knowing. And I think it's important here to remember this Greek influence, this heavy emphasis in this culture on intellect and head knowledge. I mean, in this first century culture, one of the forms of entertainment was getting together and having arguments. I know that there would be people who would still thrive on that now and love that, but that's one of the things that they held in high regard was this intellectual advancement. And I'm not saying that we don't want to be thinkers at all. But Paul seems to understand and use a very specific idea of knowledge. Some scholars have tried to argue that this knowing here for Paul, he's trying to communicate or demonstrate that this knowledge leads them to have some sort of like insider information, that the more knowledge they have this direct communication to God that not everybody has access to. But if you follow those scholars down there thinking, usually that's the dead-end trail. Because I think what's more likely is that Paul's writing to this group of people who he knows has this heavy Greek influence, and he's trying to remind them of their counter-formation as people who follow Christ. And for the rest of the world, the things that they put their pride in and the things that they deem as powerful, Paul's saying we have a different set of values. And so for Paul, he uses this word knowing, knowledge, which is a verb. And he uses this in connection to the Old Testament understanding of knowledge, which emphasized this deeply personal and mutual relationship between God and his people. Knowing God is about a relationship, a mutual relationship between God and God's people. And that's what knowing looks like. And I think it's important to emphasize this, the idea of knowledge versus knowing. One of our students is named Jonathan Bedell, and he is a sports guy through and through. But he doesn't just like sports. He's incredibly intelligent, and he's one of those guys that can rattle off stats and remember dates and histories, and he has this incredible wealth of knowledge and information, and he'll say things, and I'll be like, he's just probably making that up, and then I'll look, and it will be exactly what he said it was. Last year, for the March Madness tournament, you can fill out those brackets. I think I'm still grieving a little bit that our March Madness tournament didn't happen this year. It's one of my favorite times of the year. But last year, Jonathan filled out a bracket, and he got all 4 Final Four teams right. So it starts with 68 teams and gets down to the Final Four, and then eventually you have a national champion. But he got all 4 Final Four teams correct. And I looked, and the percentage of brackets that had all Final Four teams right were 0.00005%. I mean, Jonathan's one of those guys that March Madness, fantasy football, like all of those things, he always does well in those things. And so I texted him this week, wanted to make sure I could talk about him on this, and he said that's fine. But I asked him, hey, who's your favorite athlete? And he's a homer, so he said Matthew Stafford and Blake Griffin were his two favorite athletes. And so I thought about Matt Stafford. And I bet that Jonathan could tell you most of his professional statistics. He probably could tell you a lot of his college statistics. He may even be able to tell you some of the things about Matt Stafford as a football player in high school. I mean, he knows a lot about Matthew Stafford. He could tell you this fact or this fact or this fact. But if you were to ask him, do you know Matt Stafford? Or does Matt Stafford know you? He would say, well, no. I don't know if he's met him. Maybe he has at a game or something. But Jonathan, who knows so much, who has all of this knowledge about Matthew Stafford, doesn't actually know Matthew Stafford. And I think that's an important distinction. I think that's one of the things that Paul's trying to emphasize in these verses, is that distinction between knowledge and knowing. See, Paul wanted his listeners to understand this deeply personal and intimate and transformative knowing of Christ. It's a verb. If we look back to that connection that this word knowing has in the Old Testament, the understanding of knowledge from the human side, knowledge is expressed in response to loving obedience to God's self-revelation. Let me say it again. Knowledge and knowing, or being known, is expressed in self-giving love. And that's kind of where we end today, kind of where Paul ends today. Because he talks about that knowing, and there is this response, this self-emptying, this self-giving love. The word that we've been using time and time again in this study that Paul is talking about is this idea of a cruciform life. That we don't just want to participate in the good things of Christ, but we also are recognizing and open to the participation, the picking up of one's cross, which sometimes looks like co-suffering and co-laboring. Sometimes it looks like putting others' needs before your own. It can look like all of these things, but that was so important for Paul. Paul didn't just want his listeners to think about following Christ as having all of the good moments of following Jesus. But for Paul, it meant both. It meant emptying yourself, giving up of yourself, putting others before yourself, to know the resurrection, but also to participate in Christ's suffering. See, for Paul and for us, it starts and stops with Christ. I mean, Jesus is our litmus test. Everything we want to know and try to understand about our faith should be held up to the image and the reflection of Jesus. Paul saw his life and his ministry. He saw everything that he was about as a replaying and a reflection of the life of Christ. Not just in the good things, but also in the bad. Paul wanted his listeners to know that from the old way of life to the new way of life, there was this transformation, and this new way of life, he had to let go of some of the old ways of thinking, some of the old things that he used to hang his hat on. He wanted his listeners to know that this righteousness wasn't because of something they did, but it was because of this connection and this intimate relationship they had with God. And he wanted them to know Christ. To know Christ and to be known by Christ. Not just to have this knowledge of Christ, but to have this deeply personal, intimate knowing of Christ that manifested itself in self-giving love. See, that's what Paul wanted for himself. That's what Paul wanted for his listeners. And that's what we want for one another today. We want that kind of love. We want that kind of life that reflects the life of Christ so intimately and so personally, that there is this distinction from the old to the new, that there's transformation and new life, new creation that happens as we live in connection to Christ. And there's this prayer that I've come across several times from St. Patrick. And I think it's a fitting prayer for us to close tonight. And maybe more than a prayer, it's a blessing or an invitation to experience Christ in this transformed life, to experience Christ in all areas. And so I'm going to invite you, if you'd like, as I read this prayer, but as I maybe more of a blessing or invitation, if you want to open your hands, just as a sign of receiving this, to remember that whatever we do to experience that deep connection to Christ. And so, if you wouldn't mind, I'll close with this prayer. And it's simple. It just says this: Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in every mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. May that reality of Christ be a reality for you today and every day. Thanks for being with us tonight. Have a great night.